for this segment, you're gonna learn a bit more than usual about my history. My relationship with this game grew and evolved over the course of years. We're telling a little story with this one, a little coming-of-age story, if you will, beginning at the very start of my adulthood and carrying us through to the creation of more or less the guy you've been listening to ramble for hours on end. This is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Even as a teenager, before Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was announced, I was a massive Monolith Soft fan, almost as massive as the games this company makes. At the time, they were arguably the only studio Nintendo was working with that was creating games that could be called genuinely ambitious. And because of that, and also knowing they weren't the largest company in the world, my jaw dropped to the floor January 12th, 2017, when it was revealed that we would be getting the next massive Monolith Soft adventure a mere 2 years after releasing the previous. From that trailer, we saw the worlds were stunning, the music was on point, the dev team was back. Didn't love how these characters looked. In fact, I remember being fairly upset about the hardcore anime slant this game was taking. I get that watching this show might give you the impression that me and anime are relatively cool with each other now, but you have to understand how much that could not have been further from the truth in my youth. I thought Marth was a girl for years. I thought Shin Megami Tensei fans were ill. It was a lot for me to play a Zelda game, a Pokemon game, or even the past 2 Xenoblade games because those crept into the anime art style more than I could handle. And yet, despite my obvious disappointment in the art direction, I was surprised to find my determination was not wavered a single bit. I respected Monolith so much that I knew there was nothing this game could do that would prevent me from showing up on day one and trusting that I would be in for an exceptional game. This was, I think, my first genuine experience with implicit trust in a developer, a phenomenon I honestly take for granted now, having a level of developer knowledge that you know who the credible dealers are. Monolith was a hero to me, a studio that I felt Nintendo needed at a time when it felt like their other studios were getting a little too comfortable. And when Xenoblade Chronicles 2 released that December, boy did I need a hero. I mentioned this phase in my life before, but shortly after the Switch launched, it was off to college for me, and video games weren't coming with, unless you were a celebratory occasion. I played 3 big games on Switch in this 2-year phase of my life. The first, of all things, was Bayonetta, then Super Mario Odyssey, as I've talked about previously, both games that I know landed lower on my list than they might for a lot of other people, and while playing those games at one of the most miserable moments of my life was not the reason for that phenomenon, it'd be foolish to deny that it was at least a factor. But then finally came the release of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And you know what? My trust was not misplaced. All of the anime-ness, the giant eyes, the chests, the bright colors, the horniness. As expected, I didn't like nearly any of that, but those qualities of the game were so trite and insignificant in the face of the larger things this game was doing mechanically and creatively that all of that fan servicey stuff just kind of rolled off my back. And not for nothing, but thanks to its visual design choices, Xenoblade 2 is aging remarkably better compared to how its predecessor did, even when you upscale it with an emulator. It's a long game, so I played it for much of my time at this college. Playing it alongside going to engineering class, oops, I didn't like that, I mean economics class, oops, I have a D for the first time in my entire life, I mean film class, oops, I somehow missed my math final because I am so incredibly checked out of this entire higher education process at this point. Throughout all of that, Xenoblade 2 was this beacon of light. The combat was somehow intellectually stimulating in a way that engaged my brain like my classes weren't. I loved the stat and gear systems of this game. I appreciated how the game had one element of RNG in the blade system, but it was one that was so supremely significant that it constantly kept me on my toes and redefined my strategies throughout the entire journey, rather than remaining laser focused on one predetermined build I had in mind. designed. Combat was as fast-paced as I wanted, scratching the fighting game part of my brain a little bit with how important canceling attack animations was and smartly stringing together the right set of attacks. Worlds like Araya and Tantal were among the best that this already best-in-class world design company had ever produced. I was charmed by the characters, and I cared about the story such that I would go to film class and literally be shown some of the greatest films of all time and spend the rest of my day thinking about this game. I was enjoying Xenoblade Chronicles 2 so much that I distinctly remember getting to the end of the game and thinking to myself, that was like a 6 out of 10. I mean, it's good, I enjoyed it a lot, but definitely a step down from the last two games. You know I was young if my first instinct when playing a game was to rate it out of 10. This is why I largely don't trust my opinions from when I was a teenager, and many games that I only have experience with during those years weren't even considered for this countdown. It's not even so much that my opinions change, just my philosophy and methodologies for analysis have changed. Now don't get me wrong, I obviously liked the game when I played it, but it was still the anime one. It sidestepped or removed so many advancements I appreciated in Xenoblade Chronicles X so that it could be more similar to the original Xenoblade Chronicles, which it was directly following up. A lot of the grand Lord of the Rings-esque scale that the original Xenoblade could pack at times was pretty significantly scaled back here. But it was still good, and I recognized a lot of the things that it did better than the first game, like combat and character depth. And hey, just culturally, Xenoblade 2 was undeniably a hit on arrival. To this day, it remains the best-selling game in the series, arguably the fan favorite, although I'll admit I'm not quite as learned on how it stacks up to 3 compared to the other two games. Had a lot more time to look into stuff like that when I was younger. And Xenoblade 2 is largely responsible for the modern-day state of Monolith and the Xenoblade series. It defined what Xenoblade is and feels like now as an established big boy Nintendo series. The character designs instantly became more iconic and recognizable than the vast majority of what had come before. The art style landed so strongly that not only did all future games adopt it, but past games were updated to match it, and Smash Bros. Fans accepted the reality that the newest Xenoblade game was always going to be a top contender for inclusion from now until the end of time. In the end, I dropped out of college. My relationship with the education system was irreparably damaged, my connection to film and television as mediums was essentially completely severed, Mario Odyssey and Bayonetta are forever scarred as games I played during perhaps the saddest time of my life, but Xenoblade 2, somehow, I kept thinking about it. This surprised even me. I knew I liked the combat, it was in the running for my favorite combat in the genre, but the characters and story? I mean, I liked them. I could probably have admitted that Xenoblade 2's cast was the most fleshed out, emotionally deep, thematically rich in the series, but beyond that, and plus the story, I mean, Xenoblade 1's story just had so much more punch. When I think of the first Xenoblade, the things that come to my mind first are the big moments. The raid on Colony 9, Monado 2, all of the races coming together for the final battle, Shulk's awesome over-the-top screaming. But when I thought about Xenoblade 2, the things I thought of were so much more, well, pretentious sounding in comparison. I thought about how I usually hate how played out the evil religious organization trope is in this genre, yet in Xenoblade 2, it's probably my favorite tackling of the theme ever. Because it wasn't really about the organization or what they were doing, it was about how the individual characters that I cared about interacted with religion. How Rex's gung-ho spirit feeds his belief in the goodness of the architect, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't be able to give hope to this person he cares about. How the other side of that coin is Jin, who suffered a great tragedy and now sets his sights on the established religion as a way to change the world, such that no one has to suffer that way again. To Malos, whose religion-related station in life has left him so despondent and indifferent that no matter how desperately he searches, he can't find meaning or purpose in anything, let alone find it in himself to believe in a faith. Religion is good or religion is bad isn't even a valid point here. Such simplicity seems reductive in the face of what this game presents, which is a multi-layered look into how one construct individually impacts each character in such different ways and how that coalesces with who they are to craft their motivations. And of course, religion is just one theme I happen to use as an example. The simple fact that is the depth of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 created a compounding effect. Whereas those big moments I talked about in the original Xenoblade are outstanding at face value, what Xenoblade 2 offered me came with an interest rate. A promise that as I explored this game more, the more I will get out of it. That goes both for this increased focus on theme and characters in the story, and the nature of this combat system, which remains arguably the most replayable in the series. Heck, it even goes for the soundtrack. No one on planet Earth has ever thought Xenoblade 2's soundtrack was anything less than outstanding, but over the years, I've picked up more motifs. I've noticed more elements of consistency and homogeneity throughout the soundtrack that give it a firm identity as the composers ironed out what a Xenoblade soundtrack is meant to sound like. I grew to appreciate a balance in mood and purpose that makes this massive 9-hour soundtrack somehow perfectly delightful to listen to front to back. There is remarkably little skipping in Xenoblade 2's OST as you bounce from Ace's unmatched battle themes, Kenji Hiramatsu's instantly iconic overworld themes, Manami Kyoto's thick layer of atmospheric enhancement, and Yasunori Mitsuda's emotional gut punches. It's so big, yet so balanced and ridiculously high quality, merging elements of orchestra and rock and electronic, perfectly utilizing the advantages of each, such that I struggle to find fault with this soundtrack despite its size. For the past 3 years or so of my life, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is the video game soundtrack that I have personally considered the greatest I have ever heard. Although I certainly wish our medium luck in topping it eventually. You can probably imagine where my story went after college, right? I continue to engage with and replay this game, trying out new blade combos, finding the best builds I can, enjoying the fast-paced combat I always loved. I realize the full intelligence of the story, I continue to investigate the depth of these characters, I continue listening to the soundtrack, and I realize just how much fixating on the anime-ness and the more intimate nature of the game, rather than focusing on larger-than-life scale, was incredibly short-sighted, much like my snap decision to rate this game a 6 out of 10. But you may have also noticed something a bit more significant, if you've paid close attention to this series, that is. I thought I would like Xenoblade 2 less because its plot wasn't as big and at the forefront, but I ended up liking it even more thanks to a richness of themes and character. I seem to like the fast-paced and complex nature of its combat, qualities that may put others off but stimulate my brain in a way few other games can. I realize that no matter how many great movies college threw at me, none of them could hold a candle to the meat on the bone that was a 60-hour story-driven adventure with an interactive component that allowed you to extend that story well into the hundreds with meaningful added context and adventure. I realized that I shouldn't disregard games just because they use a style I don't like, that any game, regardless of how it looks, can win you over massively with other qualities. I fully appreciated how much you can learn to love something when you take the time to fully understand it, to not take your first instinct as law. All of these are common themes and comments I've made throughout this entire series, all of which I realized as a result of my time with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I was more open-minded about games, expanding my horizons into the many anime-style games that now populate this list. I realized my preference for character over plot. I realized I was a bit atypical for enjoying marinating in depth and complexity for long periods of time, where mainstream audiences typically appreciate something more easily digestible. And I learned that for all of these reasons and many more, video games was the medium I belonged in. A mentality that has dominated my life ever since. That is my story with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. A story that has a lot more to do with discovering myself than it has to do with Rex discovering Elysium. Although, just so we're clear, Monolith remains a hero developer to me. My appreciation of 2 continues to grow even today, and while I reject the notion of rating games out of 10, especially when you've just finished them, if I were required to assign a number to Xenoblade 2, I think something in the ballpark of a 10 would be far more appropriate.